In this lecture, we'll discuss translating arguments into the language of propositional logic. We'll work through the following example. The first premise is either Bill is dreaming or he's hallucinating, unless there really is an elephant in the room. The second premise is Bill is awake and there really is an elephant in the room. And the conclusion is that Bill isn't hallucinating. The first step is always to identify the logic words and the atomic sentences. On page 15 of chapter 2 of the reading, there's a list of canonical logic words in English. The negation is not, the conjunction is and, the disjunction is either or, the conditional, if then, and the biconditional, if and only if. There's other ways of expressing these same truth functions, so we need to be on the lookout for the non-canonical modes of expressing these notions. Of particular interest are the non-canonical modes of expressing the material conditional. A list of some of the more common non-canonical modes include only if, when, provided. Of particular interest and complexity is the word unless. We understand A unless B to be equivalent to if not B, then A. Returning to our sample argument then, we notice some of the words from that list. We mark them in red, either or, unless, and the contraction of the negation. The atomic sentences are the basic sententional units in the target sentence that don't have any truth functional logical structure to them. One example is Bill is dreaming. Another example is he is hallucinating. And a third is there really is an elephant in the room. We see some of those sentences repeated several times throughout. There's really an elephant in the room, for example, occurs again in sentence 2, and Bill is hallucinating occurs as a sub-sentence of the conclusion. On its surface, it may seem that Bill is awake is a fourth atomic sentence, but we need to be careful of hidden logical relations between our atomic sentences. Consider the relation between Bill is awake and Bill is dreaming. Those two sentences are contraries. It's absolutely impossible for them both to be true. That logical connection would be lost if we treated them as two separate atomic sentences. And so we need to posit extra logical structure that's not apparent on the surface. In particular, we change the sentence Bill is awake into the negation of the atomic sentence in 1, transforming sentence 2 from Bill is awake and there's really an elephant in the room to Bill isn't dreaming and there's really an elephant in the room, revealing some of the hidden logical connections that exist between these two sentences in sentence 1 and sentence 2. Once we're satisfied that we've made overt all of the truth functional logical structure of the argument and identified all of the distinct atomic sentences, we associate the atomic sentences with atomic sentence letters, creating our translation manual. There are 3 atomic sentences in our target sentences. Bill is dreaming, he is hallucinating, and there really is an elephant. We associate each with its own atomic sentence letter, creating our translation manual. We assign to the atomic sentence Bill is dreaming the atomic sentence letter P, Q to Bill is hallucinating, and R to the atomic sentence there really is an elephant in the room. With our translation manual complete, we first substitute the atomic sentences with their associated atomic sentence letters, creating a hybrid translation or an intermediate translation, leaving in place all of the English logic word expressions. In that case, we translate sentence 1 into either P or Q unless R, 2 into not P and R, and the conclusion into not Q. This intermediate step oftentimes makes it easier to work out the logical structure of more complex sentences. In particular, in our case, a sentence like sentence 1 that contains more than one logic word. We also want to transform non-canonical logic words like unless into their more canonical forms. Recall from our discussion of page 21, sentences of the form A unless B are treated as equivalent to the sentence if not B, then A. Applying that to our target sentence 1, we get the following transformation. If not R, then either P or Q. The disjunction is part of the consequent of the conditional. The entire sentence itself being a conditional, that's revealed in part by either occurring right next to Bill is dreaming, and the unless occurring and modifying that whole disjunctive sentence. That suggests that unless is the main operator of the sentence, and the disjunction is constrained to the consequent of this conditional sentence. Transformation of the sentence only uses the canonical logic words, thus making it much easier to perform the final step of the translation, which is translating the logic words into the truth functional symbols. Returning then to page 15, we can remind ourselves that negations are translated with the negation symbol, conjunctions with wedge, disjunctions with V, material conditionals with arrow, and material biconditionals with the double arrow. Applying those translation principles to our target sentence, we then get the final translation. For sentence 1, negation R arrow, PVQ, notice the parentheses telling us the scope of these two operators. For this sentence, the arrow is the main operator of the sentence, and the V is secondary, governing only the consequent of the conditional. For sentence 2, we translate negation P, wedge R, and for the conclusion, negation Q. Once you've translated the argument, you're asked to decide whether or not the argument is valid. Is it possible then for all of the premises 1 and 2 to be true, while C is false? If the answer is yes, then the argument is invalid. If the answer is no, it's not possible for all of the premises to be true while the conclusion is false, then the argument is valid. One way to be guided is to look at your atomic sentences. The truth value of those atomic sentences is what determines the truth value of these more complex sentences. So we want to ask ourselves, what truth value do these 3 sentences have to have in order to make 1 and 2 true while C is false? Well, it's most clear what would be involved in making C false. C is false just in case Q is true, because a negation, not Q, is going to be false precisely when Q is true. So we want to make Q true. Move now to the next least complex sentence, 2. We want, remember, to make both of the premises true, so we want 2 to be true. Well, to make 2 true, we need both not P and R to be true. The second of those is straightforward. We want R then to be true. First is the case when P is false. Under those conditions, not P is true and R is true, and so sentence 2 is true. Now we need to check that 1 is also true in this possibility. We'll discuss the truth conditions of the material conditional in more detail in the following lecture. In this circumstance, in which there is an elephant in the room, the antecedent, not R, is false, which is enough for the truth of the conditional. So, we've described a possibility, the possibility in which Bill is not dreaming, he is hallucinating, but there really is an elephant in the room. That's a possibility in which 1 and 2 are true, and C is false, and so this argument is invalid. I'll end this lecture by discussing a complexity in connection to premise 1. Premise 1 is the following sentence: either Bill is dreaming or is hallucinating, unless there really is an elephant in the room. Now, remember, our translation technique takes premise 1 to be equivalent to the material conditional. If there's not an elephant in the room, then either Bill is dreaming or he's hallucinating. But it's not an unnatural reading to take that sentence to be saying something stronger, something more like the following: if there's not an elephant in the room, then either Bill is dreaming or he's hallucinating. But if there is an elephant in the room, then Bill is neither dreaming nor hallucinating. Whereas our translation technique takes the original sentence to only be making a claim about Bill's state, conditional on there not being an elephant in the room. On the stronger reading, the sentence is making claims about Bill's state of dreaming and hallucinating, both conditional on there not being an elephant in the room and conditional upon there being an elephant in the room. On this stronger reading, the sentence is really a biconditional, saying that there's not an elephant in the room if and only if either Bill is dreaming or hallucinating. Now, this issue really concerns conditionals and biconditionals more generally, and it really points to a general problem in translating conditionals in English. That's because we often use sentences of the form if A then B to mean not just the material conditional that we would translate with the arrow, but instead the biconditional, A if and only if B. As an example, suppose that Mom says to Billy, if you eat your broccoli, you'll get some ice cream. Now, she expects to be taken to mean that Billy will get ice cream if and only if he eats broccoli. Mom would accuse Billy of not understanding what she meant if he responds, great, I'll take the ice cream now. Mom didn't merely mean to be ruling out the circumstance in which Billy eats his broccoli and doesn't get ice cream. She was also ruling out the other direction, the circumstance in which Billy gets ice cream and doesn't eat his broccoli. So it's true enough that oftentimes we use sentences of the form if A then B to mean something much stronger than the meaning that's captured by the single arrow. It's a very controversial issue whether or not this shows some inadequacy in the standard translation of the conditional. However, one way of trying to defend the traditional account is to distinguish between what the sentence itself means from what an agent means in uttering that sentence. And so, in this case, Mom meant one thing, the biconditional, that Billy will get ice cream if and only if he eats his broccoli. But that's not what the sentence she uttered means. That further meaning shouldn't be imported into the meaning of the sentence itself. And our translations are meant to capture the meaning of the sentence itself. While it remains controversial for the purposes of Philosophy 8, I encourage you to translate all sentences of the form if A then B as AROB, and all sentences of the form unless A, B, or equivalently B unless A, also as the material conditional negation A arrow B.